All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Fall 2018 Nevada Voter Protection webinar. My name is Andrew Hairston. I'm a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office, and honored to be your host for this webinar series. Before we get started, I'd like to give a shout out to a collaborative of organizations with which we have worked to make this web series possible. In addition to Advancement Project, we have Unidos US, Race Forward, Demos, the National Congress on American Indians, the National Urban League, the NAACP, and the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We are leading racial justice organizations that are partially funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which made this series possible. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and get started. So a little bit more about Advancement Project. We are a national racial justice organization that uses legal communications and organizing strategies to build power in communities of color throughout the country, all with the goal of eliminating structural racism. And you can learn more about us by visiting our website at advancementproject.org. Particularly, there are several programs within Advancement Project, one of which is our Power and Democracy program. The Power and Democracy program is dedicated to eliminating barriers to the polls for communities of color and ensuring that those communities have the ability to fully participate in American democracy in a meaningful way. So again, my name is Andrew Hairston. I'm a staff attorney in the National Office of Advancement Project. I'm only licensed to practice law in Louisiana, and this presentation is only intended to be used for informational purposes, not for legal advice. Why do we vote? A very pressing question and relevant in this era. Something particularly for communities of color that in the 240 plus years since the founding of America has weighed on our minds. Voting is really an avenue for dignity, for self-determination, particularly in the face of rampant racial discrimination in voting, both in the past of America and in its present. Voting really creates an opportunity for communities, especially communities of color, to shape the society in which we want to live and build it up for the generations yet to come. So I'd like to highlight a particular Supreme Court case that was decided after the Civil War during what's called the Reconstruction era of American history. Now, during the Reconstruction era, African Americans made some gains in the South in the fields of political participation, and civic engagement. But there was a significant backlash to that progress, perhaps because of this principle articulated in Yickwo versus Hopkins, this case. Yickwo says, voting is regarded as a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights. By voting, we're able to influence education policy, housing policy, access equal opportunities to employment. Voting really does provide, as alluded to earlier, that groundwork for shaping a society in the way that we want it to operate. Another reason we vote, for those who have sacrificed and done so much for our communities of color, for Black and brown communities throughout this nation, one of whom, Cesar Chavez, a labor organizer and farm worker from the Southwest United States, particularly Arizona, who really moved forward the needle on racial justice and equality for Black and brown communities. Now, with all of this in mind, with the racial discrimination of certainly slavery and then the Jim Crow era that followed it, there was a watershed moment that occurred in 1965 with the signing of the Voting Rights Act into law. President Lyndon Johnson signed this law to enshrine in federal law the protections of what was supposed to be conferred by the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But the Voting Rights Act really, for the first time, operationalized or gave teeth to the principles expressed in constitutional amendments passed. to really set up enforcement mechanisms to ensure that states with histories of racial discrimination wouldn't be able to continue them with ease, and to ensure that communities of color throughout the country had access to voting power that was legitimate. Now, however, 50 plus years after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, there has been a significant backlash, very similar to that of what was experienced following the Reconstruction era of American history. So there's particularly a case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder. And Shelby County eliminated what was called a pre-clearance formula within the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So under this pre-clearance formula, states that had histories of racial discrimination in voting had to petition to the federal government before they could enact certain changes to election laws or voting laws. And Shelby County did away with this pre-clearance formula under the notion that since it had worked in the past, it was no longer needed. The wake of this decision of Shelby County has seen a massive increase in voter suppression tactics, ranging from strict voter ID laws throughout the country, the elimination of early voting and same-day registration, just a host of issues that really disproportionately impact communities of color. So with all of this historical context in mind, recognizing the very true significance of voting, I will get into some of the mechanics of what you'll see in Nevada leading up to Election Day, on Election Day, and even a little bit after Election Day. We'll get into the meat of this. So a few things on registering to vote in Nevada. A person has to be at least 18 years old on or before Election Day. They must have been a Nevada resident for 30 days before the election. Must be a resident of what's called your precinct, your local voting area, for at least 10 days before the election. You must be a U.S. citizen. Must not have been declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. And must not claim any other place as your legal residence. So a few notes on folks who may have had contact with the criminal legal system. In Nevada, if a prospective voter, has one non-violent felony conviction, their voting rights may be automatically restored. So kind of depending on the felony conviction itself, that perhaps triggers the ability to get rights restored automatically. And then if a Nevadan has more than one felony conviction, regardless of violent or non-violent, they will likely have to go to court, petition a court, and ask a judge for their voting rights to be restored. So a few notes on voter registration materials. You can register to vote by mail or online by going to the Nevada Secretary of State's website. And after you submit this application to register to vote, your county clerk or your registrar of voters will mail you a voter information card. And that will have information about your polling place on it. A few voter registration deadlines to keep in mind. So the mail-in deadline is October 9th, 2018, to submit your physical voter registration application. You can register in person by Tuesday, October 16th, and you can register online up until Thursday, October 18th. There is an early voting period in Nevada that will be held from October 20th through November 2nd, 2018, and the general election will be held on November 6, 2018. So once you do submit your application, either online or in person, or you mail it in, you can go and verify your voter registration at this link that appears on the screen on the Nevada Secretary of State's website. So a few notes about college students who want to vote in Nevada. A college student may choose to register using their current campus address or if they don't live on campus, the address that they use to receive correspondence from the university. And additionally, regardless of whether a college student is currently living out of state or out of their voting precinct, they may vote in their home precinct. Again, a precinct is that local area where you vote through an absentee ballot, if you so choose. And we'll get more into absentee ballots soon. So we understand that life happens and perhaps folks may have to move before voting day and before election day, and sudden moves we know can impact brown and black communities even more. And so we want to highlight this information. A voter who moves to another county or even within the same county before election day may update their voter registration information online at registertovotenv.gov. Now, updates must be sent by the general registration deadlines. Remember those dates: October 9th, October 16th, October 18th. Now, if you move within your county, a little bit more information on this. A person who has not updated their voter information but moves from a precinct to a different one but remains in the same county, or moves within the same precinct, so certainly within the same county, must be allowed to vote in the precinct that they previously resided in. And so this can be done after providing an oral or written affirmation of something, just confirming that you are, within the same county, within even the same precinct, perhaps, to an election board officer in your county. And then that would require you also to confirm your new address. So a few requirements for voter registration groups, if you engage in this type of advocacy and work to register folks to vote. So any individual or organization may distribute voter registration applications, but these have to be subject to the state and federal laws that apply. If you request 50 or more forms from either the Nevada Secretary of State or your local county clerk or registrar of voters, you must complete a mail-in voter registration application distribution plan, which can be found online at the Secretary of State's website. Now, with all of that information in mind, we can move on to election day and what you'll see when you go to the polls on November 6th. There are various forms of voter ID that are permissible in ID in Nevada, pardon me. They include state-issued IDs such as a Nevada driver's license or a Nevada ID card. Also, documents issued by the federal government, such as a passport or a tribal ID card. You can also use an insurance plan ID card or a student ID. To establish your residence, so these on the left column might be used for residence and identity. And then if you just have one of the items on the right column to establish residence, you can use those. Things ranging from a bank statement to a paycheck to an income tax return or utility bill can be used only to establish residence, not identity. So there are various forms of obligations that applies for those voter registration groups that we mentioned earlier. Once you fill out the distribution plan and submit it to the Secretary of State, you must, if you engage in this work, deliver voter registration applications to the State Division of Elections no later than 10 days from the day of the collection or by the close of the registration preceding the next election, whichever is sooner. So it might be the case that you go to a county fair, perhaps right now in mid-September, and collect registration applications for voters. You have 10 days from that county fair to submit the applications instead of, let's say, the October 9th deadline, because 10 days from now would be sooner than October 9th. So a little bit more on voter ID requirements at the polls. A registered voter only needs to have their name, on the rolls or on the roster, and they must sign their name in the roster or on a signature card when they apply to vote. And then the election board officer at the polling place on election day will compare the signature to the signature on the person's application to a signature on a driver's license or a state-issued ID. And there are a few caveats to that. This rule does not include where a voter is unable to sign their name, where a voter has recently moved, but that is not reflected on the roster. I'll remember particularly if you move within your precinct or within your county. And then first-time voters who have registered via mail or computer, or if an affidavit of cancellation, something of the effect was executed on the voter's registration the day before the election. And that's a pretty specific rule. So if any of those categories apply, you would be exempted from that signature comparison process. So the polls will be open for 12 hours on election day in Nevada. They'll be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. If you are in line at 7 p.m., you should have an opportunity to cast your ballot. Generally, political activities are prohibited within 100 feet of a polling place, which includes, wearing T-shirts with the candidate's information or pins and such, or actively supporting a candidate by your expression. And there will usually be markers in place to show you where 100 feet from the polling place might be. Now, to find your polling place, you can go online to the Secretary of State's website and conduct a voter search. It'll tell you your polling place as well. A few things to keep in mind for those who need accessible voting machines. Voters who are differently abled cannot be denied the right to vote solely because of their disability. Polling places generally need to have been certified compliant under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Now, ahead of the election, recognizing the number of counties that do administer elections, all of them on the day of, it's good perhaps to follow up with the county clerk or registrar before going to the polling location to ensure that all accessibility needs are met. And keep in mind that all county officials are required to make reasonable accommodations to allow a person to vote in their polling place. And if there are registered voters who, because of a disability or an inability to read or write English, are unable to mark a ballot or use a voting device, you can request assistance from anyone at the polls except for your employer, an agency of your employer, or an officer or agent of the voters' labor organization if you're a part of a union. So language and access in Nevada. It's important to note that Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 requires election officials to provide language assistance under certain circumstances. Language assistance is required when there are more than 10,000 people, or over 5% of the citizens of voting age in a jurisdiction, who are members of a single language minority group. So in Nevada, in particularly language access, now if it's determined that there's a significant and substantial need for voting materials of the county or city to be provided in the language or languages of that minority group expressed on the previous slide, the county clerk may prepare voting materials in such languages. Now, a significant and substantial need can be established if the community has been subject to historical discrimination. As we discussed earlier in this presentation, the racial discrimination that has existed and persisted in America in voting, and if they have been subjected to unequal educational opportunities and are of limited English proficiency as a result. And it's important to keep in mind that since Nevada was formerly Mexican territory, this principle applies to Spanish language access for voters across the state. So a little bit more on absentee ballots. As mentioned earlier, absentee ballots are those that you use to vote by mail, so you don't actually go to the polling place. You can request an absentee ballot by submitting an absent ballot request form online at the Secretary of State's website, and then you can send it in to your local county clerk or your registrar of voters. Now, this request form must be received by any time before 5 p.m. On October 30th, 2018 for this election. So the deadline is October 30th at 5 p.m. for the absent ballot request form. And then the absentee ballot itself must be received no later than the day of the election, so by 7 p.m. on election day. So with all of this information in mind, there may be a situation in which you're challenged at the polls where someone goes against your eligibility or says that you are not permitted to vote on their information and belief. Now, there's a very fine line between intimidation and a challenge. And keep in mind that you will have the right to vote without being intimidated, threatened, or coerced. So if you are challenged by someone at the polls on election day, you can take an oath. You can say out loud under oath, provided by the election board officer in their presence, that proves that the issue that you're being challenged over does not apply to you. And so there might be a couple of challenges that take form, such as a challenge of the voter's identity. You can, in this situation, if your identity is challenged, swear under threat of or consequence of penalty and perjury that you are the person whose name is in the election board register. And you can provide a photo ID as required in Nevada. And then for a residency challenge, if somebody says that you don't live where you say that you live, it's a similar process of swearing under oath. And you can provide your proof of address. So that goes back to the documents that prove residence that we mentioned earlier, ranging from a utility bill to a paycheck to a bank statement. Now, what happens if your name does not appear on the rolls on election day? One, you can ensure that you are in the correct polling place by going online to the Secretary of State's website to the voter search application. But you also can submit what's called a provisional or temporary ballot. And that will come with the oath as well, or some type of signature that you'll offer to say that you are a registered voter in what's called the jurisdiction or that county and are eligible to vote. And provisional ballots should be counted as regular ones, particularly after the identity is verified or your eligibility is verified. If lack of ID is the cause, you can go home and retrieve an ID. And if not, on the day of, that's not possible. You must provide identification to the county clerk no later than 5 p.m. on that Friday after the election. And if that deadline isn't met, then the provisional ballot won't be counted. So there's also an opportunity for engagement that consists of becoming a poll worker. Now, poll workers must be registered voters in their paid positions, and they must complete training. Poll workers serve a really critical role in ensuring fair election administration on election day. You can follow up with your county clerk or your registrar of voters for more information on becoming a poll worker. Again, to locate your county clerk, you can go to the Nevada Secretary of State's website. So as we mentioned earlier, there's a very thin line between a challenge on eligibility or ID or residence and intimidation. Intimidation can take many forms, such as being shouted at or having abusive language directed toward you, someone repeatedly asking about a person's citizenship status, someone lying about being an election official and deliberately spreading misinformation, bringing a gun to a polling place, or posting misleading things on social media. So it might be that you see a tweet or a post on Facebook that says voters of one party vote on this day and voters of other parties vote on another day, which would be misleading and false and a form of intimidation. It's also important to keep in mind that you may see police officers when you go to vote at your polling place, and the presence of these law enforcement officers should not hinder you from exercising your right to vote. So there are various things to do when you encounter a form of voter intimidation. You can document the occurrence with notes or take a picture. If you have a pen and pad, you can take notes or use the notes application on your phone. You can report the activity to a poll worker and your local county clerk or registrar of voters. You can also report the intimidation to the National Election Protection Coalition, of which Advancement Project is a member. And you can do this by visiting 866rvote.org or call 866-687-8683. And you can also consult with local advocacy organizations and poll monitors to determine your next steps. A few thoughts on strategic engagement ahead of the election. So we're getting close to that 6-week mark from the November election. And you can aim to meet with your county clerk or registrar of voters during this time frame. Also, you can monitor voter purges. So there's a federal law that's been in effect for nearly 3 decades called the National Voter Registration Act, that is the NVRA. That prohibits election officials from conducting mass purges within 90 days of a federal general election. And we're within that 90-day period now. And it might be that you're saying when you're going to verify voter information online on the Secretary of State's website, you're saying that folks aren't coming up, and you can use that information to see whether or not the county clerk has impermissibly conducted a mass voter purge. You can also encourage community members to sign up to become poll workers. And if you engage in voter registration efforts, you can review the obligations for such work, such as submitting your distribution plan and making sure that registration applications are in within 10 days of you receiving them. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the Supreme Court in the last term decided a case called Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute that concerned Ohio's what's called supplemental process under the National Voter Registration Act. And that case concerned using a voter's inactivity as a trigger for removing that voter from the voter rolls. Now, although the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Ohio Secretary of State in that case, that supplemental process would have required 6 years to elapse before the person would be removed from the rolls for voter inactivity. And so the biggest thing to take away from Husted is that the protections of the NVRA still largely remain in place for the November 2018 election. So with all of this information in mind, and as you prepare for meetings with your county clerk or your registrar of voters, there are several questions that we recommend asking just to see what the response may be, and how to anticipate challenges that may arise. Have you closed or consolidated any polling places, and where are those polling places located? How do you notify voters of these polling place closings? What are some of the common problems observed when processing voter registration applications? What happens if a registrant's information does not match the information in the state or federal database that the county clerk uses to verify identity? Under what circumstances will voters be removed from the voting rolls in advance of the November 2018 election? And how will voters be notified of emergency polling place changes on election day? A few more questions to keep in mind and ask. How are voter registration applications processed? If mailed before but received after the deadline? How do you respond to poll workers and or challengers in the polling place who insist on improperly challenging voters? So when it goes from a challenge to intimidation. And if there's an observed problem at the polls on election day, is there a direct number that you can receive from the county clerk or registrar of voters to report it? So with all that information in mind, I want to open the floor up in the space for questions if you have them. Feel free to use that Q&A tool. All right. Well, we just want to thank you so much for joining this presentation. If any questions do come up, you can feel free to reach us at our office. You can email me at ahairston@advancementproject.org. You can call us at 202-728-9557 and follow us on social media, ADV_project, for various updates on our voter protection work ahead of the November 2018 election. You can also visit nationalrighttovote.org for information on our power and democracy initiatives and voter protection work. And just one more disclaimer, this was intended to be used for informational purposes only, and it should not be construed as legal advice and should not be interpreted as creating an attorney-client relationship. Again, we thank you for joining, and we wish you all the best as you prepare for the November 2018 election. Take care.